Okay, in this video I am going to talk about the recent pass rates. We've seen level 1 and level 2, but before I jump into that, while I have everybody's attention, I just want to draw your attention to one thing here. If you're a subscriber on our site, you'll notice on the My Videos page we have two links up, request a tutoring session or request academic counseling. For tutoring sessions, we've been able to secure a large number of charter holders who recently have passed level 3 and are charter holders, some CPAs at this point, who are willing to help out, who are willing to provide tutoring at a much more reduced rate than what you're going to find in the market. So this is for our subscribers only. This is the tutoring request form. You just fill in your information, you leave a message on what you need. The cost is 65 Canadian per hour. The nice thing is the session can be shared with up to 3 candidates, you and 2 others. So if you did a 2-hour session, it's 130 Canadian, split 3 ways, is $42.50 an hour, basically Canadian, or $42.50 per person. So if you divide that by 2 hours, you're basically paying something around $21 an hour Canadian for tutoring. That's 65 Canadian per hour. If you think better in US, is about $47, $48 US. I don't think you're going to find a market rate like that out there. So if you are a current subscriber and you do want some extra one-on-one tutoring, we've done our best to try to get the lowest possible rate for you while providing you with the highest qualified individuals we can to get this done. So there you go. That's out there. Let's lead into these low pass rates that we've seen, and the explanation still from CFAI. I say still because I don't expect them to be changing their mind on every different result. The explanation is that they still continue to see a difference between those who are sitting for the first time versus those who have been deferred, and that the overall malaise of the pandemic is having an effect on candidates. So we're gonna just, or I'm gonna, tear those numbers apart in a couple of different ways, and then present a number of hypotheses that I think at the margin all have some merit. So let's jump into some screens here. Okay, busy screen here. I've done a number of calculations just to sort of, test the plausibility of certain cohorts achieving certain failure rates. The argument put forth is that, for each exam we have 2 cohorts. We have cohort 1, which is taking the exam for the very first time, and we have cohort 2, which has been deferred a number of times. And the argument so far is that, well, this cohort is experiencing a much lower pass rate, and this cohort is experiencing a normal pass rate, that once the pandemic and all the deferrals end and everybody's sitting for the exam the first time, we expect all the pass rates to return to historical norms. Okay, let's just test that with some different proportions. Let's see what proportion of the exam would have to have been deferred, sitting for that exam, to achieve the failure rates or the pass rates, the small pass rates that we currently have. So I've got the pass rates here for level 1, 2, and 3 from May. From July there was only level 1, and from August for level 1 and level 2. We don't know level 3 yet, but level 3, yeah, it's down from its historical range of 55, 56, 57% down to 42, but without seeing August, I'm just going to leave it be for now. And let's start with August, and let's go backwards. And we'll start at level 1. 26% pass rate, and the CFAI reports that 16,000 candidates sat for level 1 in August, and there was a 26% pass rate. Level 1 in July was a 22% pass rate, and July was a particular exam. I don't recall, but I don't think it was open to new candidates. I think it was just a spillover for deferral. So we're going to assume that this 22% was 100% deferred. And it sets sort of a baseline to say, okay, well, if the deferrals, if July were 100% deferred and 22%, let's assume in this 26% that the deferrals got 22%. So we're going to wait. I put the 0.45 here. If we go back to the first exam, June of 2019, which was the paper-based exam, I took the pass rate as a baseline for those who sat for the first time. A 45% pass rate will give it a weighting of W, and a 22% pass rate, which is what July, assuming they're deferred, will give it 1 minus W. W is the weighting of those who are sitting for the first time. 1 minus W are those who have been deferred. To achieve a pass rate of 26%, assuming those sitting for the first time would score normal, and those that were deferred, well, are under some sort of different pressure. Let's just not worry about hypothesizing why. We'll just take it on faith that, okay, so you're seeing a lower pass rate. We'll ask the why questions later. I get a weighting of 17.39. That means out of the 16,000 people that sat in August, only 2,782 were sitting for the very first time, and 82% of this number had been deferred from previous exams. So we can ask ourselves, does that sound reasonable that 82% of the people sitting in August for the August Level 1 exam had been deferred, and only 2,782 candidates were new? About 100,000 candidates come into the system at Level 1 every year. About 100,000, so we're saying 2,782 only. So we can say, well, I don't know. Let's try some different proportions here. Let's assume it was 50-50, that 50% of this 16,000 were brand new, Level 1 candidates sitting for the first time, and 50% were deferred. And if we assume a 45% pass rate, a normal pass rate, for those sitting for the first time, what would have been the pass rate for those that were deferred? 7%. So if it were 50-50, what we're saying is those that were deferred only had a 7% pass rate. Well, that just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, to have a 7% pass rate for those that were deferred. But again, that's not making a big assumption. That's assuming that half the people were deferred and half the people were new. Let's say that only 40% were new and 60% were deferred. That means you had in the deferral category a 13.3% pass rate, which again is kind of hard to believe that it would be that low, 13.3% versus 45%. I don't think so. So we would have to say, well, you know, if we assume that this was 100% deferred, we would have to accept these weights, that there are very few new candidates that appear to be entering the system if we accept it. Let's go to Level 2. Let's see if we can figure out anything there. For Level 2, I don't know what base rate to use, because there is not one exam where we can say, well, nobody was allowed to sign up, everyone was deferred. But we could use the argument that, well, look, there was only a December 2020 exam and a February 2021 exam. So the only people who could have gotten to Level 2 were those who passed Level 1. They must have wrote in December or in February, or they had passed Level 1 in 2018, 2019 and never signed up again. So it's hard to find what a baseline is, but what we can do is just work on proportions. So let's say for Level 2, we say it was 50-50, and for August, they reported that 10,000 people sat for Level 2. 29% pass rate, and I'm using the pass rate for the last exam that was unaffected by the pandemic. It was 43%. I get to x equals 15%, which means those who were deferred had a 15% pass rate. If we assume it's 50-50, I don't think it was 50-50. I think the proportion of new candidates writing for the first time is significantly lower. So I did a 40-60, a 30-70, even going to 30-70, the pass rate would have to be 23%. If I use the same weights for Level 1, I get 26% pass rate. So that if you have your two cohorts of candidates, this cohort 1 and cohort 2, and cohort 1 was writing for the first time and these were deferred, what we're saying is that, well, if we observe a 43% pass rate here, we would have to observe a 26% pass rate here with these weights to get to 29%. And if we assume that, well, in August, let's just assume that very few people were actually brand new, which is, I don't know if it's unrealistic, being that there was only a level 1 and a level 2, sorry, a level 1 exam last December and February. You can't go from May to August anyway, so we can just discount that. So it might be close to being 100%. That might be the baseline, or 29% pass rate out of those 10,000. So when I start thinking about the mix of candidates, it really shows up at level 1 more than anything. When I start thinking about the mix of candidates you need, those not deferred and those deferred, to get to 26% pass rate, those who are deferred had a much lower pass rate than 26%. Again, going to 50-50, we would have to say, does 7% sound realistic? Not really. Does 50-50 sound realistic? Well, maybe. Does 40% new and 60% deferred sound realistic? Because those who were deferred could have written in December. Some level 1s wrote last December. Some wrote in February. There were some that wrote in March, by the way. We don't hear too much about March anymore. Many of those wrote in May. A whole bunch wrote in July. And again, new people enter the system every single year at level 1. But I don't think it was as low as 2,782. I don't think it was as low as that. Which means that this pass rate of 0.22 for those who were deferred would be a maximum. I think it's lower than that. I think the ratio, even going to 40-60, was like this. Then we have a 13.3% pass rate for those that were deferred. That, to me, seems like a stretch, which means that this argument here is not a complete argument. Maybe there is a difference between those who are sitting for the first time and those that were deferred. Maybe it is a statistically significant difference, but with an N of $10,000, almost anything will be statistically significant between the two. But is it so far apart that you have in this cohort here a 45% pass rate, but in this cohort here you have maybe a 13% pass rate? I don't think so, which means that this argument is not quite a complete argument. It may be a factor at the margin, but it's not a complete argument. Something else is going on. Okay, so on the last screen, what I did, just to recap, is I applied a bunch of different weightings to a cohort 1, and I'll draw that little box again, cohort 1 and cohort 2, those being deferred, and I applied some weightings just to see that if we assume a normal pass rate for those who are writing for the first time, how low would the pass rate have to be for the second cohort to recover a 26 or a 29% pass rate for level 1 and level 2. And we saw that if we assumed 50-50, the pass rate for level 1 would have to be as low as 7%. That's unrealistic. That is way out of line, very unrealistic, so we know it's not that. I'm not discounting factor 1 here, the deferred cohort. I do think that in running the numbers over at CFAI, for those who wrote for the very first time versus those who deferred, they are probably seeing a statistically significant difference. The question of why is a question for further research. It's a puzzle. It's an anomaly of why it would be. We can observe something and then we ask why. Well, that's a research project for the learning theorists and the sociologists. Let's just accept that their data showed that, and okay. However, the pass rates between the two cohorts would have to be so wide apart that it hardly makes any sense for it to be that low for the cohorts. If we anchor the first cohort to 45% pass rate. However, if you relax this assumption and you say, well, what if the pass rates for this are in fact lower, and let's say they're at 0.35? What would the pass rate have to be for the second cohort to recover that 26%, we get to 24%. Well, if we assumed, remember for July, we assumed 100% was deferred and we had a 22% pass rate, there's 24. Okay, that seems to make a lot of sense. It starts to make more sense once you relax this assumption over here, that those who wrote for the first time did not experience the historical pass rate at level 1 or at level 2, but they experienced something much lower. Which means that the deferred cohort, while it being true, or let's just say, while it's possible that it is 100% true, that the deferred cohort had a lower pass rate than the non-deferred cohort, it's not a full explanation, it's only a partial explanation, because if you run the numbers and try to make it fit and recover 26%, the weightings don't make a lot of sense, or the weightings make sense, but the scores don't make a lot of sense. So let's introduce another factor, the COVID effect on cohort 1. Maybe this group over here is under a little bit more pressure. The isolation, the psychological effect of the isolation from being quarantined or from being away from other people or from being in cities where you have lockdowns for an extended period of time. The added stress of being around the same group of people for as long as you are. The maybe financial stress of having lower household income, the emotional stress of having family members who have passed on because of COVID or are very sick or have gone through COVID. So maybe it has an effect on this cohort as well, and they have a lower pass rate at the margin. Some people will have a lower pass rate, and that will have an effect on the aggregate pass rate for the group. Okay, so there's factor 2, and we can accept that. Is that enough to explain these differences? I've got a few more factors, just out of curiosity here. Is fewer questions having an effect? So let me see if I can add some light to that. Now, the rationale that they've given for fewer questions is that, statistically speaking, if you ask 180 questions for level 1 or you ask 240 questions, there is not much more information in those extra 60 questions that they can't already figure out in the 180 questions. Okay, that sounds like a reasonable argument, but let's just break it down. There are 57 readings at level 1. So if we just take averages, I know that some readings have many more questions and some readings almost have no questions, but let's just take averages just to ask ourselves if it sounds reasonable. With 57 readings and 240 questions, this is what it used to be. That's an average of 4.2 questions per reading. The average page count per reading is about 42 pages. So that's one question for every 10 pages of content. When you bring it down to 180 questions, you have an average of 3.16 questions per reading, or one question for every 13.3 pages. So let's say that I break the content up into 13.3 page segments. And I ask one question within each of these 13.3 page segments. You're either going to get 0% or 100%. Within there. There's your distribution of your score within those 13.3 pages. So I must come to the conclusion within that 13.3 pages that you don't know any of it, or you know it all. There is no distribution. Now imagine that I asked 2 questions for those 13.3 pages. You're either going to get 0, 50%, or 100%. I have a better distribution. If I asked 3 questions, I would have an even better distribution. So if I asked 10 questions and you were a 50% student, I'd find out that you were a 50% student. Probably, if I asked 12 questions, I wouldn't have any more information. Or if I asked 14, I might not have any more information. But I'm certainly going to get more information if I move from 1 question to 2 questions. I'm going to get significantly more information. So at a macro aggregate level, saying 180 to 240 questions isn't much new information. When you break it down to a micro level, I don't know that the micro adds up to the macro argument. 1 question for every 13.3 pages, and I'm either going to display that I know nothing about those 13.3 pages or that I know everything about those 13.3 pages? So I think with fewer questions, there is some effect on this pass score. There has to be. And now we're told at level 1 for the 180 questions that there's a number of questions that aren't even graded. They're there just as test questions, so it's actually one question for maybe every 15 or every 16 pages. Well, that was my doorbell. I'm sure you noticed the break in the video here. Okay, so factor 3, fewer questions. Could that be doing something? I don't know, but there's the hypotheses, right? Factor number 4, higher MPS. There is some people who do work on the MPS who try to triangulate the MPS after every exam. And if you look at the graph that they have, you can see that the MPS has been creeping up over the years, of which I'm not against, by the way. I'm not against a higher minimum passing score. But that could be playing a factor as well, that perhaps some people are still preparing for a 65 to a 70% minimum passing score, while now it's ranging in the 71 to 73% range. So could it have crept up by 1 or 2% to the point where you would say, well, listen, it's moved up 1 or 2%. We really haven't moved the minimum passing score. It just appears, that 1 or 2 would not be an admission of moving the passing score, but it could have an effect. So factor 4. I'll put that down as well. Here's an interesting one because I'm going to introduce our data down here. And this occurred to me this week here. Could it be that fewer people have used a third-party provider? And I got this one from factor 2. The COVID effect on cohort 1 by one of the assumptions is that, maybe lower household income has an effect on the stress levels of candidates that are preparing. Maybe jobs aren't as plentiful as they used to be, or maybe they had a job and lost it during this period of time. And I thought, well, if that's the case, maybe they are showing less propensity to use a third-party provider. The estimate that we have is about 60%. This is pre-COVID. About 60% of candidates actually admitted to using a third-party provider based on exit surveys out of the exam. That it's about 60% that have a propensity to use third-party providers. Could that have dropped to 50% or 40%? And a lot more self-study. And with a lot more self-study, a lot more uncertainty. A lot less clarity. Nobody to say, hey, can you explain this to me? Or nobody, no video to watch that explains it all. And maybe just relying more on the free videos on YouTube, which aren't really current, are dated. Maybe they're learning the wrong things. So I put that down as a factor too. Now this can be tested, by the way. All of this can be tested if you have the data. But the data only exist in a super secretive place, so I don't think they're going to share the data with us. But you could take cohort 1 and you could take cohort 2. And if you could divide cohort 1 and cohort 2 by those that admitted to using a third-party provider versus those that did self-study, find out if there is a different pass rate between those two groups. And if the financial stress of the pandemic has at the margin reduced the number of people who had a propensity to use a third-party provider, that could also explain a few points. So I don't know that you're going to get an explanation of a 20% drop in the pass rate, going from 45% down to 25% is a 20 point by saying it's this or it's this. I think this has an explanation, but it's not complete. I think this is an explanation, but it's not complete. I think this is an explanation, but it's not complete. I think all of these little things add up to something. So you'd put all these variables in a regression and you'd get the data out and you'd test the data if you could get the data. This is typically, as an analyst, what you would do when you see an anomaly in the marketplace is you'd say, Let me come up with a number of hypotheses that could explain this, and that'll tell me the data that I need, and that data will then enter into a regression, and I can then test the coefficients on that regression to see which of those variables do in fact explain that outcome. Well, I know that CFAI does watch my videos, so hey guys, look, here is a beautiful regression that you can run if you want to get a little bit more insight into what you're doing, and I would kind of look to this a little bit, because I'm skeptical about that one, especially when I think about the distribution at the micro level. I don't think adds up to the distribution you expect at the macro level. I just don't think that it works that way. Anyways, so let's see why I think factor 5 matters here, and why I think it's a bunch of these factors as well. Our packages are 1 fee to pass. So we have 3 types of candidates. After results are released, we have 3 buckets. We have those who use the 1 fee to pass and repeat the same level. We have another bucket of those who were at one level who then buy the next level. And in the third bucket, we have people who do nothing. They neither used the 1 fee to pass, nor did they go to the next level. So let me break this down for you. And I will say right off the top, our pass rates are lower than they used to be, but still significantly higher than the pass rates that are published. They're lower because I do think that factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, factor 4 do have a role to play. For level 1, and this is just from May. Here, 7/27 means that's the date the results were released, and it's been 87 days since the results were released. For level 2, it's been 80 days, and for level 3, it's been 73 days. For everyone we had registered for level 1 May, 5.6% of them have used the 1 fee to pass, which would imply that if we only had two groups, those that used the 1 fee to pass and those that moved on, we would say if you just look at 5.6%, you'd say you have a 94.4% pass rate. No, we don't, because there's a group of people we don't know what they're doing yet. They have not used the 1 fee to pass, nor have they moved to level 2. It's easy to walk away from level 1 if you fail it. You write the exam, you do not pass, you look at it, you go, listen, I'm still at square one. I'm no further along. I'm still at the very beginning. I can walk away. So if all the people on our site who have not done anything yet, actually, if we assume they all failed and walked away, we have a 71% pass rate in May for level 1, which is much lower than what we've seen with our 1 fee to completion. So we know that factors 1 through 4, if I'm hypothesizing, well, factor 1 and factor 2, these are CFAI's hypotheses they're putting out here. Factor 3 and factor 4, these are hypotheses that are floating around out there that I think have some validity at the margin, so I include them. So I think those first 4 factors are playing a role, but we have 70, even including all of that, we're still seeing a 71% pass rate. Now the ones that haven't done anything could just be saying, well, I'm not doing anything till this is over. To assume that they all failed, I don't think that's right. But as time goes on, more of those people do make decisions to do something, so our number here will get better and better as time goes on. Level 2, 15.3% of those that were subscribed for May, that wrote in May, have used the 1 fee to pass. However, if we assume all of the other ones who have done nothing failed, 100% of them failed, we'd still have a 73% pass rate. This is almost double what our repeat rate used to be. And this is significantly higher on our repeat rate as well. Level 3, 19.15% have used the 1 fee to pass. If we attribute all the others who did nothing to failure, would be at 77% pass rate. We have fewer people at level 2 who have made no decision, and even fewer people at level 3 that have made no decision, because it's much harder to walk away from level 3 if you fail, because you have one exam to go. You're so close, it's hard to walk away. So we had very quickly, many of them, well, those who didn't make it did reschedule for November or May very, very quickly. In fact, I think I have the percent that actually scheduled for level 3. 92.2% of those who used the 1 fee to pass scheduled for November, and 7.8% scheduled for May. So we know exactly where they deferred to. These are easy numbers to get because it's a transaction that actually happens on the site. So 19.15 gives us an 80.85% pass rate. And if we assume all the ones that did nothing, we only get to 77%. So you can see there are very few people at level 3 who are undecided about what to do, but a lot at level 1. I think that's a big problem. I think that if you start deterring people that early in the system at level 1, you take a lot of people out of the system that wouldn't otherwise get to level 2. Level 2 is harder to walk away from than level 1 because you have got one behind you. And you just got 2 in front of you. At level 3, it's only 1 more in front of you. So we have these pass rates, level 1, level 2, level 3. These will get tighter as time goes on. In fact, they'll only increase from this point because, again, we assume that everyone who didn't either repeat or move on failed. We're just assuming they failed and went away. We know that's not true. So these will only increase. So when we look at May of level 1 and we see the pass rates from May as low as they were let's just call up my screen again just so that I can look at the right numbers here. 25% versus our 71, 40% for level 2 versus 73, and 77 versus 42. These are lower than they've ever been for us. So I know that there's something going on up here, factor 1 through factor 4. However, these are higher than the industry, so I know there's something going on here that I think that fewer people have decided to use a prep provider. Well, listen, if every one of these factors is responsible for 2 or 3% difference in the pass rate, if you got 5 factors that are responsible for 2 or 3% at the aggregate, you get 10 or 15% difference in the pass rate. There we go. That's a more logical explanation, is that it's not this or that or this. It's a little bit of everything. How much is each one worth? I don't know. Only a regression can tell us that. But for that, we need the data, and we're not going to get the data. So if you want to increase your probability of passing, factor number 5, use a third-party provider. Doesn't have to be me. There are lots of good ones out there. Rather than fighting through all of the content on your own, sometimes it can save you a lot of time and effort. Use a third-party provider. If we can get more people doing that, you could probably increase the probability. Number 2, if there is a higher MPS and we have fewer questions, that just means the game is more serious. So that, if you're at level 2 and you can remember how you studied for level 1, well, you may have to put in a little bit more time and a little bit more effort and a little bit more focus on that. And I think that as we get through the pandemic and things start to ease, here in Ontario, in Canada, our provincial government is talking that by March, all restrictions will be lifted, including masks. So we got maybe 5 more months of it, and then off it goes. It will all be lifted and go away. I think all these will pass in time.